My daughter left a newborn on my porch and disappeared, and 24 years later, she walked into a courtroom without realizing the man across from her was the baby she abandoned. I remember that night with a clarity that never faded, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there long after everything else is blurred. It was late October, the kind of cold that creeps in early, when the air smells like fallen leaves and the sky goes dark before dinner. I had just turned off the kitchen light and was about to head upstairs when I heard it, a faint sound at first, like something small scratching against wood. I paused, listening, thinking maybe it was a stray cat or the wind pushing something loose against the siding. But then it came again, sharper this time, unmistakable. A cry, thin, fragile, and desperate. I opened the front door slowly, the porch light flickering on above me, casting a pale yellow glow over the worn wooden boards. And there he was, a baby, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, placed carefully in an old laundry basket, as if whoever left him wanted to pretend this wasn't what it was. For a second, I couldn't move. My hands just hovered there in the cold air, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. Then I saw the note, folded once, tucked into the blanket like an afterthought. I picked it up with trembling fingers and read the only line written in my daughter's handwriting. "Mom, I can't do this. Don't look for me." That was it. No explanation. No apology. Just absence, wrapped in ink. I looked down at the baby again, his tiny face scrunched from crying, his little fists pushing weakly against the blanket like he was already trying to fight the world he'd been dropped into. And something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, steady decision settling into place. I bent down, lifted him into my arms, and felt how light he was, how completely dependent, how unaware of the choice that had just been made for him. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me, shutting out the cold, the dark, and whatever part of my daughter had chosen to walk away. I didn't call the police. I didn't call anyone. I just stood there in my living room, holding him, listening as his cries slowly softened against my shoulder. The house felt different in that moment, like it had been waiting for something I didn't know was missing. I told myself I'd figure it out in the morning, that this was temporary, that there would be some kind of explanation. But even then, deep down, I knew the truth. She wasn't coming back, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I didn't go after her. If she could leave him behind without looking back, then I would be the one who stayed. I walked into the kitchen, warmed a bottle I hadn't planned to need, and sat at the small table by the window, rocking him gently as the night stretched on around us. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the last leaves on the trees, but inside, it was quiet. Just me and a child who didn't belong to me, and yet somehow, in that moment, already did. I didn't know what the next day would look like, or the next year, or the next 24. I only knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had been left on my porch, and I was the one who opened the door. I did not sleep that night. Not really, because every time I closed my eyes I heard him again, that thin, fragile cry that had pulled me to the door in the first place. So I stayed at the kitchen table with the small lamp on, watching the clock tick past midnight, and then 2 in the morning, and then 4, learning the rhythm of a life I had not planned but had already accepted. And when the first pale light of dawn slipped through the window, I realized I had made a decision without ever saying the words out loud. I was not waiting for my daughter to come back. I was not hoping for an explanation. I was preparing to raise this child as if he had always been mine. And that realization settled over me with a strange calm that surprised even me, because I had spent years believing that motherhood was something you finished, something you completed when your children grew up and moved out. But sitting there with that baby in my arms, I understood that some roles do not end. They simply change shape when you are not looking. I stood up slowly, careful not to wake him, and walked through the house with a new awareness of everything that needed to be done. The spare bedroom that had become a storage space, the old crib I had not touched in decades, the drawers filled with things I had once saved and never had the heart to throw away. By the time the sun fully rose, I had cleared the room, opened the windows, and begun to rebuild a space that had once belonged to a different chapter of my life, and now belonged to him. I called the pediatrician later that morning, my voice steady as I explained that I had a newborn who needed to be seen. I did not explain how he arrived, and no one asked too many questions, Because in a small town, people learn when to look closely and when to let things be. The doctor said he was healthy, a little underweight but strong, and that was enough for me. I stopped at a store on the way home, buying things I had not thought about in years: diapers, formula, tiny clothes that felt impossibly small in my hands. And with every item I placed in the cart, I felt the weight of responsibility grow, but it did not scare me, not the way it should have. Instead, it grounded me, gave me something clear and immediate to focus on, something that did not involve wondering why my daughter had walked away without looking back. I did not call her. I did not try to track her down. I folded that part of my life away the same way I folded the note she had left, placing it in a drawer where I would not have to see it every day, because I knew that if I let myself dwell on it, I would start asking questions that had no answers, and I did not have the luxury of getting lost in that kind of thinking anymore. There was a child in my home who needed to be fed, held, and protected, and that was where my attention belonged. The first night turned into the first week, and then the first month, and slowly the house began to change. The quiet that had once filled every room was replaced with soft sounds, a small voice crying, a gentle breath against my shoulder, the creak of the rocking chair that became my place more often than not. I named him Noah because it felt right, simple and steady, a name that carried a sense of beginning rather than loss. And when I said it out loud for the first time, it felt like a promise I was making, not just to him, but to myself, that whatever had been broken the night he was left on my porch, I would not let it define what came next. I would build something new, something stronger, even if I had to do it alone. The years did not pass all at once. They unfolded slowly, in quiet routines and small sacrifices that no one else ever saw. And before I realized it, Noah was no longer the fragile baby I had carried through sleepless nights, but a steady presence in my life. A boy who learned to walk across the same wooden floors where I had once stood unsure of everything. A child who filled the house with questions, laughter, and a kind of warmth I had not expected to feel again. I worked more than I ever had before, taking extra shifts at the grocery store, cleaning offices in the evenings, doing whatever I needed to make sure he had what he needed. And sometimes that meant choosing between things, between a new coat for myself or school supplies for him, between a quiet moment to rest or another hour of work. But I never let him see those choices. I made sure his world felt stable even when mine felt stretched thin. The house became a place built on routines: breakfast at the same time every morning, homework at the kitchen table, bedtime stories even when I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. And through all of it, Noah grew into a boy who noticed things: the way I rubbed my hands together when the bills came in, the way I paused before buying something that was not strictly necessary. He did not say much about it at first, but I could see it in the way he tried to help, the way he put his toys away without being asked, the way he sat quietly beside me instead of demanding attention, as if he understood more than a child his age should. When he started school, I watched him from the edge of the playground on that first day, his small hand letting go of mine without hesitation, walking forward with a confidence that made my chest tighten, not from fear, but from something deeper, something closer to pride. The teachers would tell me later that he was bright, that he listened carefully, that he had a way of thinking things through before speaking, and I would nod and thank them, keeping my emotions steady the way I had learned to do. But inside, I held on to every word, because they felt like proof that the decision I had made that night had not been a mistake. As he grew older, the questions came more often, not just about school or friends, but about where he came from, about why there were no baby pictures before a certain point, about why there were no stories of his mother or father. And each time, I felt that same quiet tension settle in my chest, the past pressing gently against the life we had built. I never lied to him, but I did not tell him everything either. I would say that families come in different shapes, that sometimes people make choices they cannot undo, that what matters is who stays, not who leaves. And he would listen, his eyes searching my face as if he was trying to understand something just out of reach. I knew the day would come when those answers would no longer be enough, when he would want the truth in a way that could not be softened or redirected. But I held on to the time we had, the years where our life felt complete in its own way, where the absence of others did not feel like a loss, but simply the way things were. And even though I rarely allowed myself to think about my daughter, there were moments when her memory surfaced unexpectedly, in the curve of Noah's smile, in the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, small reflections that reminded me of where he came from. But I never let those thoughts linger, because they belonged to a past that had chosen to walk away, and I had chosen something else entirely. I had chosen to stay, to build, to raise a boy into a man. Without looking back, and for a long time, that choice was enough. By the time Noah reached his teenage years, the house no longer felt like a place built out of necessity, but something steadier, something earned through years of quiet persistence. And yet that was also when the questions began to change, no longer simple or easy to answer, no longer satisfied with the gentle explanations I had given him as a child. He had grown into someone observant, someone who noticed patterns and gaps. And one evening, as we sat at the kitchen table with his textbooks spread out between us, he looked up from his work in a way that made me pause before he even spoke. There was a seriousness in his expression that I recognized immediately, the kind that meant he had been thinking about something for a long time, not just in passing. And when he finally asked, his voice was calm but firm. He did not ask where he came from in a general sense. He asked why he had no one else, why there were no visits, no phone calls, no relatives who checked in. And for a moment, I felt the past press in closer than it had in years, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to return. I set my hands flat on the table, steadying myself before I answered, choosing my words carefully, not because I wanted to hide the truth, but because I understood how much weight it carried. I told him that sometimes people make decisions when they are not ready, that sometimes they walk away instead of staying, and that it does not always mean they did not care. But even as I said it, I knew it was not enough. He listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving mine, and when I finished, he nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he understood that I was giving him as much as I could in that moment, but not everything. And that quiet understanding unsettled me more than anger would have, because it meant he was patient, and patience has a way of uncovering things over time. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes in him, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would point out, but I saw it in the way he spent more time alone in his room, in the way he lingered over old boxes in the hallway closet, in the way he asked questions about dates and timelines that seemed casual on the surface but carried deeper intent. I did not stop him. I did not redirect him the way I might have when he was younger, because I knew that trying to control the answers he was looking for would only make him search harder. Instead, I watched, quietly, the same way I had learned to do years ago, giving him space while preparing myself for the moment when the truth would no longer be something I could soften. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the front steps, the same place where I had first found him all those years ago, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the empty street, as if he was trying to imagine something that had happened there long before he could remember. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unnoticed, feeling a strange mix of pride and unease, because the boy I had raised was becoming a man who would not accept half answers. And while part of me feared what that would mean, another part of me knew that this was inevitable, that the life we had built together was strong enough to hold the truth, even if it changed the way he saw everything that came before it. And as I stepped outside and sat beside him, I realized that the time I had been quietly preparing for was no longer somewhere in the future. It was already here, waiting just beneath the surface of a conversation that had not yet begun. He did not ask me anything that afternoon on the porch, not right away. And that was what made it harder, because silence, when it comes from someone who is thinking deeply, carries more weight than any question spoken out loud. We sat there side by side, the late afternoon sun stretching shadows across the yard, and for a while it felt almost peaceful, like any other day, but I could sense the shift in him, the way his thoughts were moving beneath the surface, steady and deliberate. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. He said he had been looking through old documents in the house, things I had never hidden but had never pointed out either. And he mentioned the absence of records before a certain date, the lack of hospital paperwork, the way everything about his life seemed to begin all at once, as if there had been nothing before it. I felt a stillness settle over me, not fear exactly, but the recognition that the moment I had been preparing for had arrived without warning. I did not interrupt him. I let him finish, because I knew he needed to say it in his own way. And when he looked at me, there was no accusation in his eyes, only a quiet determination to understand. He asked me directly then, not where he came from, but why I had never told him the full story. And that question landed differently, because it was not about the past alone. It was about trust, about what I had chosen to protect and what I had chosen to keep from him. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of years in that single moment, and I realized that there was no version of the truth that would leave everything unchanged. But there was also no reason to hold it back any longer. I told him about that night, about the sound at the door, about the cold air and the small basket on the porch, about the note written in a hand I recognized immediately. I did not rush through it. I let each part settle, giving him space to absorb what I was saying. And as I spoke, I watched his expression carefully, not for signs of anger but for understanding. When I told him that the person who left him there was my daughter, his mother, he did not react the way I had once feared he might. There was no sudden outburst, no rejection, only a long silence that seemed to stretch far beyond the moment. He looked down at his hands for a while, as if placing this new truth into the life he had always known. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost reflective. He asked if she had ever tried to come back, and I shook my head slowly, telling him that she had not, that she had left without looking back and had stayed gone. I could see something shift in him then, not a break, but a quiet recalibration, as if he was adjusting the way he saw himself, not as someone missing something, but as someone who had been chosen in a different way. He nodded once, taking it in, and then he said something I did not expect. He said that he had always known, not the details, but the feeling, that there was a reason things were the way they were, and that hearing the truth did not change what mattered most to him. I felt something ease in my chest at those words, a tension I had carried for years finally loosening. And as we sat there together, I realized that the truth had not broken what we had built. It had simply given it a clearer shape, something stronger, something that did not depend on what had been left behind, but on what had been chosen every day since. And in that quiet moment, I understood that whatever came next, we would face it the same way we always had, not with noise or anger, but with a steady certainty that had carried us through everything before. After that conversation, something between us shifted in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to ignore, not because it created distance, but because it replaced uncertainty with clarity, and clarity has a way of changing how everything feels even when nothing on the surface appears different. Noah did not withdraw the way I had once feared he might. He did not question the life we had built or treat it as something less than what it was. Instead, he moved forward with a kind of quiet focus that I had seen in him since he was a child. Only now it carried more purpose, more direction. He began to spend more time on his studies, not out of pressure or expectation, but because he had chosen a path for himself, one that seemed to take shape naturally as he grew older. He was drawn to understanding how systems worked, how decisions were made, how rules could be interpreted and applied. And I watched as that curiosity turned into something more defined, something that guided him through high school and into the choices he made afterward. When he told me he wanted to study law, he did not make it sound dramatic or ambitious. He simply said it as a matter of fact, as if it was the next logical step in a process that had already begun years earlier. I nodded, not because I fully understood everything that choice would involve, but because I recognized the certainty in his voice, the same certainty I had felt the night I brought him inside. And over time, our roles began to change in subtle ways. I was still the one who kept the house running, who made sure everything was in place. But he became someone who contributed in ways that went beyond what I had expected. He took on part-time work. He managed his own schedule. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that made people take him seriously. And through it all, he never treated me as anything less than the center of his world. There were no dramatic declarations, no need for reassurance, just consistent actions that spoke more clearly than words ever could. When he left for college, the house felt different again. Not empty in the way it had once been, but quieter, as if it was holding space for something that had grown beyond its walls. I adjusted the same way I always had, through routine, through small habits that kept everything steady. And we stayed connected in simple ways: phone calls, brief visits, conversations that did not need to be long to be meaningful. I could hear the change in him over time, the way his voice carried more authority, the way he spoke about his studies with a clarity that reflected how deeply he understood them, and I knew that he was building something for himself that went far beyond the life we had started together. Years passed in that steady rhythm, each one bringing him closer to the person he was becoming, and I never once felt left behind, because everything he did seemed to carry a piece of where he had come from, not as a burden, but as a foundation. And even though I rarely thought about the past anymore, there were moments when I would find myself standing by the front door, looking out at the same porch where everything had begun, and I would think about how a single decision, made in a moment of quiet resolve, had shaped an entire life, not just his, but mine as well, and I would realize that whatever came next, whatever paths crossed or moments unfolded, we had already built something that could not be undone, something steady enough to hold whatever the future might bring. Time has a way of revealing things when you are no longer looking for them. And by the time Noah finished law school and stepped into his career, I had learned to trust that whatever needed to surface would do so in its own way, without force, without urgency. Just as everything else in our lives had unfolded, he did not come home with grand announcements or dramatic milestones. He simply continued forward, building a life that reflected the quiet discipline he had carried since he was young. And when he accepted a position at a respected firm in the city, he told me about it over the phone in the same calm tone he used for everything important, as if he understood that success did not need to be loud to be meaningful. I listened, picturing him in an office far from the small house where he had taken his first steps, and I felt that familiar mixture of pride and distance, not the kind that separates people, but the kind that reminds you how far someone has traveled. We settled into a new rhythm again, one shaped by occasional visits, longer conversations, and the quiet understanding that he had his own world now, one that extended beyond what I had been able to give him, and I was content with that, because it meant he had built something strong enough to stand on its own. It was a late afternoon in early spring when everything shifted again, not in a dramatic way, not with any kind of warning, just a simple knock at the door that echoed through the house with a familiarity I had not felt in years. I remember standing in the kitchen, drying a dish, pausing as the sound carried through the hallway, and for a brief moment, something in me hesitated, not out of fear, but recognition, as if some part of me had always known this moment would come eventually. I walked to the door slowly, my steps measured, my hand steady as I reached for the handle, and when I opened it, I saw her standing there, older, more composed, dressed in a way that suggested a life very different from the one she had left behind, but unmistakably the same person, my daughter. She did not speak right away, and neither did I. We stood there in silence, the years between us stretching out without needing to be named, and when she finally did speak, her voice was controlled, almost rehearsed. She said my name as if it were something unfamiliar, something she had not used in a long time, and then she asked if she could come in, not as a request filled with emotion, but as a simple formality. I stepped aside without answering, not because I had decided anything, but because I understood that this moment was not about what I wanted. It was about what had already begun. She walked into the house slowly, her eyes moving across the room, taking in the details as if she were trying to reconstruct something she had once known, and I watched her carefully, not searching for regret or explanation, but observing the way she carried herself, the way she seemed more focused on the present than the past. And when she finally turned to face me, she did not apologize. She did not ask about the years she had missed. She went straight to what she wanted. She asked about him, about Noah, her tone neutral, almost distant, as if she were inquiring about something that belonged to her by right. And in that moment, I understood that whatever had brought her back was not rooted in reflection or remorse. It was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with the child she had left behind and everything to do with the man he had become. And as I stood there in the quiet of the house we had built together, I realized that the past had not returned to be resolved. It had returned to be tested, and this time, the outcome would not be decided by me alone. She did not stay long that first day, just enough to ask her questions and measure my answers, just enough to confirm what she had likely already learned before she ever stepped onto that porch again. I told her that Noah was doing well, that he had built a life for himself, that he was working in the legal field, and I watched closely as that information settled in her expression, not with warmth or relief, but with a quiet calculation that she did not bother to hide very well. She nodded slowly, as if placing pieces together in her mind, and then she asked where he was, whether he visited often, whether he knew about her. Each question delivered in a tone that remained controlled, but carried an underlying urgency. I answered carefully, not out of fear, but because I understood that every word mattered now in a way it had not before. I told her that he knew the truth, that there were no secrets left between us, and that seemed to shift something in her posture, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. She stood up soon after that, smoothing her coat as if preparing to step back into a life that did not include this house. And before she left, she said something that stayed with me long after the door closed behind her. She said that people change, that circumstances are not always what they seem, and that sometimes things can be made right if given the opportunity. It was not an apology, not even close. It was a statement, one that suggested she believed there was still something here for her to reclaim. I did not respond to it. I simply watched her walk down the same path she had once walked away from, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared from view. And for a long time after that, I stood by the door, not thinking about what she had said, but about what she intended, because intentions have a way of revealing themselves through action, not words. The next few days passed quietly, but the stillness felt different, as if something had been set in motion that would not easily be undone. And then, as if confirming what I had already begun to suspect, Noah called me one evening, his voice steady as always, but with a subtle edge that told me he was not calling just to check in. He mentioned that he had been assigned a new case, one that had come across his desk unexpectedly, and as he described it in broad terms, not revealing details, but enough for me to understand the outline. I felt a quiet certainty settle in, the kind that does not need confirmation to be real. It involved a dispute, something tied to financial matters and contractual obligations, but more than that, it involved a name I had not heard spoken aloud in years but recognized immediately when he said it, not because it was common, but because it belonged to someone who had once been part of this house. He did not pause after saying it. He did not ask me anything directly, but there was a silence between us that carried more meaning than any question could have. I answered in the same calm tone I had always used, telling him to do what he believed was right, to trust his judgment, and to remember that the truth has a way of standing on its own when everything else falls away. He acknowledged that quietly, and after we ended the call, I sat alone in the living room, the evening light fading through the windows, understanding that the moment we had both been moving toward without fully naming it had finally arrived, not with noise or confrontation, but with the quiet precision that had defined everything else in our lives. And for the first time since she had returned, I allowed myself to consider what would happen next, not out of concern, but with a steady awareness that whatever unfolded, it would not be shaped by the past alone. It would be shaped by the choices made now, by the man Noah had become, and by the truth he had carried with him all along. The courtroom was quieter than most people expect, not dramatic or loud, but controlled, every movement measured, every word carrying weight without needing to be raised. And when Noah stepped into that space, he did not hesitate. He moved with the same steady confidence I had seen in him since he was young. Only now it had sharpened into something precise, something undeniable. I was not there in person, but I could picture it clearly because I knew him. I knew the way he carried himself when something mattered, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he allowed silence to do its work before he ever said a word. And across from him, seated among documents and expectations, was the woman who had once stood on my porch and walked away without looking back. She had entered that room believing she understood the situation, believing she could manage it the way she had managed everything else in her life. But there are some things that cannot be controlled once they begin to unfold, and truth is one of them. Noah did not rush. He did not reveal everything at once. He followed the process, step by step, allowing the facts to present themselves in a way that left no room for interpretation. And as the case moved forward, it became clear that the position she had taken was not as stable as she had believed, that the decisions she had made carried consequences she could not simply step around. And through it all, he remained composed, not cold, not distant, just clear in his purpose. There was a moment, I imagine, when she finally understood, not just the legal position she was in, but who he was, not in the sense of recognition from memory, but in the deeper sense, the realization that the person standing across from her was not someone she could influence or claim. He was someone shaped by years she had not been part of, someone whose values had been built in a house she had left behind. And when that understanding settled in, It changed everything, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone else in the room would necessarily notice, but internally, in the way she responded, in the way her certainty began to shift. Noah did not use that moment to make a point. He did not speak about the past or bring emotion into a place that demanded clarity. He simply continued, allowing the structure of the case to carry the weight of what needed to be said. And when the outcome was finally reached, it was not dramatic, not a moment of victory or defeat in the way people imagine. It was a conclusion, a clear result based on the facts that had been presented. And when he stepped away from that case, he did not call me immediately. He did not describe it in detail, because he did not need to. When we spoke later, his voice was the same as it had always been, steady, grounded, and when I asked how things had gone, he answered simply, saying that everything had been handled the way it should be, and in that moment, I understood that what mattered had already happened, not in the courtroom, not in the outcome, but in the choice he had made to stand where he stood, to be guided by the life he had lived rather than the one he had been given at the start. And as I sat in the quiet of the house that had held all of those years, I realized that nothing had been taken from us, nothing had been lost, because what we had built had carried forward into that moment and shaped it in a way that did not need to be announced or defended. It simply existed, steady and undeniable, just like the decision made on a cold night so many years ago when I opened the door and chose to stay.